A town, standing on the edge Tombstone, Arizona, in the autumn of 1881 was more than just a mining town. On the maps of the United States, it appeared as a mere dot, a frontier settlement that owed its existence to silver veins running through the desert earth. Yet, to those who lived there, and to those who passed through, Tombstone was a place that seemed half alive and half cursed, a city where fortune and death were often indistinguishable companions. It was a town where the air itself felt heavy, as though it carried secrets too dark to ever fully reveal. By day, Tombstone was chaos given form. Miners covered in dust crowded the streets, rushing from saloon to assay office with the hope that today might be the day they struck their fortune. Wagons creaked under the weight of ore, and horses stamped nervously on the hard-packed dirt, their eyes wide as if they sensed what their riders did not. Above it all, the relentless sun beat down, scorching the timber of new-built homes until they cracked and splintered, as though even wood had a hard time surviving here. But when night came, Tombstone transformed. The boardwalks filled with drunks and gamblers. The piano music of saloons fought with the shrill laughter of dance-hall girls, and the shadow of violence never drifted far. Pistols bulged under dusters, knives gleamed when lamplight hit them, and no man could truly say if he would see the sunrise. Fist fights broke out as naturally as poker games, and a single insult could be enough to send men reaching for their weapons. Yet there was something else, something less tangible, that hung over Tombstone like an unseen storm. Miners and ranchers whispered that the town was not simply dangerous, but cursed. Old-timers swore that the silver beneath the ground was tainted, that every vein of ore came with its price in blood. They said the land had been Apache once, sacred and unforgiving, and that Tombstone's prosperity was stolen from the earth itself. And when the earth is robbed, it demands payment. Some of these tales could be laughed off as drunken talk, but others carried an unsettling weight. There were stories of men who struck rich only to lose their lives in bizarre accidents. One crushed under his own wagon, another found dead in the desert, his body untouched but his face frozen in terror. Others spoke of shadows moving at the edge of vision, shapes that vanished when looked at directly. Whether these were tricks of tired eyes or something more sinister, no one could say. But the whispers continued, and they gave Tombstone an aura that no lawman ES badge or preacher thesis sermon could banish. It was into this boiling pot that the Earp brothers had come. Virgil, Morgan, Wyatt, and their ally, the consumptive but deadly Doc Holliday, represented order, or at least their version of it. Virgil was the town marshal, responsible for keeping a semblance of peace. Wyatt, a gambler and sometimes lawman, was ambitious and calculating, a man who seemed to hunger for a place in history. Morgan was quieter, loyal, and often caught in the pull of his brother's ambitions. Doc Holliday, pale and coughing blood into a handkerchief, was both feared and admired. He was the kind of man who might look death in the eye and grin. But every law has its opposite, and in Tombstone that opposite had a name: the cowboys. The Clantons and the McClorys, cattlemen by trade and outlaws by reputation, commanded both fear and loyalty. To some townsfolk, they were dangerous rustlers who bled the territory dry. To others, they were simply men standing against the iron grip of the Earps. Ike Clanton, loud and unpredictable, was often the voice of their faction, his drunken boasts filling the saloons. His brother Billy, hot-tempered and restless, was never far from a fight. The McClorys, Tom and Frank, were proud men who refused to bow to anyone, least of all to the Earps. The tension between these groups was more than personal. It was woven into the very fabric of Tombstone itself. The town stood at the edge of law and lawlessness, prosperity and ruin. The silver brought wealth, but it also brought corruption, greed, and violence. Every faction had its supporters. Every man, woman, and child knew that sooner or later something would give way. And yet, beyond politics and rivalries, there were stories that hinted at something more ominous. The night before the famous gunfight, a drifter appeared at a saloon on Fremont Street. No one knew his name, and no one saw him leave. But those who spoke to him swore he whispered a strange warning to Doc Holliday. "Tomorrow, the earth will drink blood it cannot forget, and the man who walks away untouched will never escape its shadow." Others swore that strange things were seen in the streets that night. A prospector claimed he saw shadows moving in the dust, shadows that looked like men fighting, raising pistols, falling. When he blinked, the vision was gone, leaving only silence and a rising wind. Another witness, a dance hall girl leaving work at dawn, claimed she saw a black crow sitting atop the roof of the OK Corral, its eyes glowing red in the half-light. It cawed 3 times and then it flew into the rising sun. Whether these stories were inventions, drunken exaggerations, or genuine premonitions, no one could say. But when the sun rose on October 26, 1881, Tombstone felt different. The air was heavy, as if waiting for something. Men spoke in hushed tones, women hurried their children indoors, and every sound, the creak of wagon wheels, the jingle of spurs, seemed sharper, more brittle, like a world on the edge of breaking. What happened that day would last no more than half a minute in time, but it would echo across centuries. Yet to understand that moment, to truly grasp why 30 seconds of gunfire could become legend, one must understand the world that gave birth to it. A world where fortune and death were inseparable, where law and outlaw were 2 sides of the same coin, and where whispers of curses and destiny swirled with the desert wind. Tombstone was not just a town. It was a stage, and on that stage, men carried not only their pistols, but their fates. And as the morning of October 26th dawned, the stage was set. The audience was the entire town. The actors were the Earps and the cowboys. And somewhere in the shadows, whether of imagination or of something darker, the curse of Tombstone waited to see who would live, who would die, and who would be remembered. In Tombstone, men did not merely live. They carried themselves as though the desert were watching, judging, and waiting for the right moment to claim them. By October 1881, the lines had been drawn, and the men who would meet in that infamous 30 seconds already carried the weight of their choices. They were more than lawmen and outlaws. They were symbols, walking contradictions of the Wild West itself. Each bore the marks of ambition, loyalty, or hunger, and each seemed to move with the knowledge that destiny was closing in. The Earp brothers were not saints, though history often paints them as such. Virgil Earp, the eldest, wore the badge of Tombstone's town marshal. His shoulders stooped with years of service, his face carved by duty and exhaustion. Yet there was steel in him still. Virgil was not a man who chased glory. He chased order, though sometimes his methods blurred the line between justice and survival. His limp, the result of old wounds, gave him a weary gait, but when he spoke, men listened. He carried his authority like a man clinging to the last plank of wood in a storm. Wyatt Earp, by contrast, was something else entirely. Ambition shone in his eyes like a flame that refused to die. He had drifted from town to town, chasing opportunities, wearing the badge when it suited him, gambling when it didn't. To some, Wyatt was the very embodiment of law. To others, he was nothing more than a cold opportunist, ready to bend the law if it furthered his reputation. Yet one could not deny his presence. Tall, calm, and eerily untouched by nerves, Wyatt stood like a man who believed he had already seen his future. Some whispered that he had bargained with fate itself, that bullets would never pierce him. Morgan Earp, younger and less celebrated, was the quiet shadow of his brothers. He followed because loyalty demanded it. Unlike Wyatt, he did not hunger for legend. Unlike Virgil, he did not wear the weight of command. Morgan's tragedy lay in his faith in his brothers, faith in a cause he barely understood. Some said Morgan had the gentlest soul among them, a man who might have preferred a quiet life. But in Tombstone, gentleness was a weakness, and loyalty was often fatal. Then there was Doc Holliday, the most unlikely of allies. Born into privilege, he had become a gambler, a gunslinger, and a wanderer. Consumption was eating his lungs, and his coughing fits often left him pale and trembling. Yet behind his sickly appearance lurked a deadly calm. Doc's pistols were extensions of his hands, his wit as sharp as any blade. He lived as though he were already dead, and in that reckless acceptance lay his danger. He feared nothing, not man, not law, not even the grave. Some said the devil himself walked with him, amused by his defiance. Others whispered that Doc's coughs were not of sickness but of smoke, as if his very breath came from hell. Across from the Earps stood the cowboys, a name spoken with equal parts disdain and respect. They were outlaws, rustlers, and smugglers, yet in their own way they represented freedom. The Clantons and McClorys had friends in the saloons, allies among ranchers, and sympathizers who believed the Earps were no better than tyrants. To call them villains was too simple. They were men caught in the same web of ambition and pride, unwilling to bow their heads. Ike Clanton was the loudest of them all, a man whose voice could fill a room and whose temper often spilled into threats. He was no gunfighter, not truly, but his drunken boasts painted him as one. Ike lived in the shadow of violence, talking of it, provoking it, yet rarely being the one to fire the first shot. Still, his words carried weight, and in Tombstone, words could be as deadly as bullets. Billy Clanton, younger and more reckless, had the hot blood of youth in his veins. To him, violence was not a last resort but a way to prove himself. He was said to spend nights carving the names of his enemies into wooden tables, a silent promise of future bloodshed. The town whispered about him not as a man, but as a storm waiting to break. The McClory brothers, Tom and Frank, were cattlemen by trade, but stubbornly proud by nature. They believed themselves wronged, insulted by the Earps at every turn. Frank, in particular, carried a reputation for being dangerous when crossed. Tom was steadier, though just as unwilling to bend. Together, they embodied the pride of the cowboys, the refusal to kneel, even in the face of law. These men were not simply players in a feud. They were drawn together by a force larger than themselves. Some townsfolk claimed that fate had already written their paths. A prospector swore he saw Wyatt and Billy pass each other in the street weeks before the gunfight, and for a moment the sun seemed to dim, shadows lengthening unnaturally across the dirt. A preacher claimed he dreamed of 6 coffins lined up in a row, though only 3 were ever filled. Even their appearances seemed marked by destiny. Wyatt's calm eyes, Doc's ghostly pallor, Billy's restless movements, Ike's wild stare. Each man carried a look as if aware of an approaching storm. To see them in Tombstone streets was to see chess pieces already set in place, waiting for the hand that would move them. As tensions escalated, strange stories grew. Miners reported hearing gunfire in the distance at night, though no one fired a shot. Horses grew skittish near the OK Corral, refusing to pass its gates after dark. An old Apache woman passing through town shook her head at the sight of the Earps and cowboys and muttered a single word: blood. The town itself seemed to sense the approaching clash. Saloons grew quieter when the 2 factions entered, conversations dying mid-sentence. Poker games froze when Wyatt's shadow crossed the floor. Even the air grew heavy, as though every man, woman, and child in Tombstone was holding their breath. What made these men different was not simply their guns or their grudges, but the aura they carried. They were men with fate in their eyes, men who walked as though time had already chosen their end. Some would die in the dust. Others would walk away untouched, yet haunted forever. And the strangest truth of all was this: no matter how the story ended, they had already become legends before a single shot was fired. For in the Wild West, legend did not wait for death. It was born in whispers, in glances, in the way men carried themselves as if they belonged to another world. And as October 26th drew nearer, Tombstone watched with dread and fascination, knowing that its dusty streets would soon run red, and that those who walked them would never be forgotten. The morning of October 26, 1881, dawned like any other in Tombstone. The desert sun crept across the horizon, spilling gold across the dusty streets, and the town stirred awake. But something lingered in the air, an unease, a thickness that pressed against the chest. Men spoke in hushed voices, women drew their curtains tighter, and the gamblers at the Oriental Saloon found their hands trembling as they laid cards on the table. It was as though the town itself knew that blood was coming. By noon, tensions were boiling. Ike Clanton, drunk and reckless, had staggered through town with a rifle slung over his shoulder, shouting threats against the Earps. He claimed he would kill them all before the day was done. Witnesses remembered his words as more than anger. They sounded like prophecy. When Virgil Earp finally disarmed him, dragging him before a judge for disturbing the peace, Ike was humiliated but unbroken. Stripped of his weapons, he prowled the streets like a wounded animal, his fury feeding into the tension that wrapped Tombstone in silence. As the sun dipped westward, the cowboys gathered. Billy Clanton, restless, refused to abandon his brother. Frank and Tom McClory, red-faced with anger over insults from the Earps, stood their ground. Rumors swirled that more cowboys were on their way, that a bloodbath was inevitable. Saloons closed their doors, shutters slammed tight, and men peeked through cracks in the walls, unwilling to step outside. The Earps, meanwhile, were preparing. Virgil strapped on his revolver, the badge glinting on his chest. Morgan adjusted his holster, his young face set with determination. Wyatt said little, his silence more chilling than any threat, and Doc Holliday, pale and wheezing, slid a shotgun under his coat. He coughed into a blood-stained handkerchief and smiled. This day, he whispered, was always coming. The stage was set. Two sides, driven by pride, anger, and destiny, would collide in an alleyway behind the OK Corral, a place forever burned into American legend. The Walk. When the Earps and Holliday began their slow march down Fremont Street, Tombstone fell silent. The sound of their boots striking the dust echoed unnaturally loud, as though the earth itself was amplifying each step. Bystanders froze, watching from windows, porches, and alleys. One witness later swore the sunlight dimmed as the four lawmen approached, their shadows stretching long and skeletal against the ground. Across the way, the cowboys stood near the lot, shifting nervously but refusing to back down. Billy Clanton's hand hovered near his pistol. Frank McClory's jaw tightened, and Tom McClory's eyes darted between the Earps and the open street, perhaps already regretting the path that fate had laid before him. "I want your guns," Virgil Earp demanded as they closed in. His voice was firm but not without mercy. "Throw up your hands." What happened next would never be agreed upon. Some said the cowboys reached for their weapons first. Others swore it was Wyatt or Doc who pulled the trigger. But the truth was swallowed by the roar of gunfire. The thunder of 30 seconds. The first shots cracked like lightning, tearing through the silence. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, sharp and choking. Witnesses swore the sound was deafening, rolling across the town like thunder. Billy Clanton cried out as a bullet tore through his wrist, but he kept firing, blood soaking his shirt, determination burning in his young face. Frank McClory staggered back, clutching his stomach, yet still raised his pistol with deadly intent. Tom McClory, unarmed by some accounts, stumbled backward as a shotgun blast from Doc Holliday ripped through him, throwing his body into the dust. The gunfight became chaos. Pistols flared, smoke wrapped the lot in a ghostly haze, and men shouted, cursed, and screamed. Bullets struck wood, metal, and flesh, sparking brief flashes of fire against the afternoon sun. Virgil was hit in the leg, collapsing to one knee yet still firing, his jaw clenched in pain. Morgan groaned as a round tore through his back, the force nearly knocking him to the ground. Doc laughed, a hollow, chilling laugh, even as a bullet grazed his hip, blood soaking into his pale clothing. And Wyatt stood firm. Shots rang around him, whizzed past his ears, tore into the dust at his feet, yet he remained untouched. One witness swore they saw a bullet rip through his coat without piercing his skin, as though the man was wrapped in fate's armor. Within half a minute, it was over. The aftermath in the dust. When the smoke cleared, the scene was more nightmare than legend. Billy Clanton lay in the dirt, his breaths ragged, his face pale. He begged for more cartridges, clutching his pistol until his strength gave out. Moments later, his eyes glazed over, unseeing. Frank McClory, too, lay sprawled, the life gone from him, his once proud defiance reduced to silence. Tom McClory's body twitched in the dust before finally falling still. Virgil leaned on his revolver like a crutch, bleeding but alive. Morgan, pale and sweating, was helped up by Wyatt. Doc stood coughing violently, his laughter gone, replaced by crimson drops staining his lips. And Wyatt, untouched, calm, and silent, looked down at the carnage with eyes that seemed distant, as though he had already stepped into legend. The townsfolk emerged slowly, hesitant, like survivors after a storm. They stared at the bodies, at the blood soaking into the dust, and at the lawmen who stood above them. Some whispered the Earps were heroes, defending law and order. Others muttered that it was cold-blooded murder. But no matter the words, one thing was clear: Tombstone would never be the same. Whispers of the supernatural. In the days that followed, strange stories spread. Some claimed they heard the gunfight replaying in their dreams, over and over, the sound of pistols echoing endlessly. Others swore that when they walked past the lot at night they saw figures in the smoke, reenacting the battle. Horses grew restless near the site, refusing to walk the same path. A prospector swore he saw Wyatt's reflection in a saloon window the next day, but the reflection did not move when Wyatt did. Another man claimed Billy Clanton's last words were not pleas for ammunition, but a chilling promise. This ain't over. And perhaps it wasn't. For though 3 cowboys lay dead, the feud was far from finished. The 30 seconds that became forever. 30 shots in 30 seconds. That was all it took. Yet the echoes of those seconds have stretched across centuries. Some say the Earps brought justice to Tombstone. Others insist they unleashed a curse that followed them until their graves. What cannot be denied is that in those moments the men of Tombstone stepped out of the ordinary and into the realm of myth. The sun, the dust, the smoke, the blood, they became symbols, etched forever in the memory of the West. Stand in Tombstone today, near the old OK Corral, and you may feel it still, the tension, the fear, the inevitability. Some say if you close your eyes, you can hear the shots, the screams, the desperate cries. Others claim the ground itself remembers, restless beneath the boots of tourists who tread upon it. The truth of who fired first, of who was right or wrong, may be lost forever. But the legend, that 30 seconds of thunder and blood, remains. And in the Wild West, legend was often stronger than truth. Gunfight at the OK Corral was over in half a minute, but its echo rumbled through Tombstone for months. The bodies of Billy Clanton, Frank McClory, and Tom McClory were barely cold before accusations began to fly. The Earps and Doc Holliday might have survived the gunsmoke, but they now stood at the edge of another battlefield, this time not in the dust of Fremont Street, but in the courtroom of Judge Wells Spicer. The funeral that divided a town. The day after the shooting, the streets of Tombstone filled with mourners. The Clantons and McClorys were carried to Boot Hill Cemetery, their coffins draped in sorrow. Witnesses said the procession stretched farther than the eye could see, nearly 200 people following the wagons, their steps heavy with anger and grief. At the graveside, a preacher spoke of injustice, his words carrying on the desert wind. Some swore that as the coffins were lowered, a dust devil rose suddenly from the earth, swirling violently around the mourners before vanishing as quickly as it appeared. "The land itself is angry," whispered one old prospector. "It won't let this rest easy." Back in town, the saloons buzzed. Some cursed the cowboys as outlaws who had met their fate. Others claimed the Earps were murderers, hiding behind badges. Lines were drawn, and neighbors became enemies overnight. Tombstone was no longer just a mining town. It was a powder keg. The accusation Ike Clanton, who had fled the scene of the gunfight, now emerged as the loudest voice of vengeance. His words dripped with venom as he accused the Earps and Doc Holliday of ambushing his brother and friends. He painted a picture of cold-blooded lawmen who had hunted down unarmed men and shot them in the dust. Under pressure, Tombstone's authorities arrested Virgil, Wyatt, Morgan, and Doc. They were charged with murder, their reputations hanging by a thread. The four men who had walked into the smoke of battle now found themselves shackled by the weight of the law. When they entered Judge Spicer's courtroom, the air was as thick as it had been on Fremont Street. Crowds pressed at the doors, eager to glimpse the men at the center of the storm. Some came seeking justice. Others came hoping to watch the mighty Earps fall. Inside Judge Spicer's courtroom, the trial was no ordinary proceeding. It became theater, gossip, and spectacle all at once. Witnesses took the stand, their voices trembling as they recounted the thunder of gunfire. Some swore the cowboys had been armed, their hands quick to draw. Others insisted the lawmen had fired without warning. One man testified he saw Wyatt Earp's face during the shooting, calm, cold, and untouchable, as though death itself had favored him. Another claimed he saw Doc Holliday smile through the smoke, the shotgun in his hands blazing like a dragon's breath. The details conflicted, but each story added to the myth. The Earps sat grim, their eyes steady. Wyatt rarely spoke, his silence heavier than words. Virgil winced in pain from his leg wound. Morgan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, pale and sweating, and Doc Holliday coughed into his bloodied handkerchief, smirking at the accusations as if the trial itself was a bad joke. At night, the defendants were released on bail, but they returned each morning to face their accusers. Rumors spread that the cowboys had friends watching the courtroom, ready to strike if the verdict displeased them. Some nights, Wyatt claimed he heard footsteps following him in the dark, but when he turned, no one was there. Shadows and whispers. Beyond the facts and testimony, darker tales began to circulate. A bartender claimed the courtroom was haunted. He swore he saw the shadow of Billy Clanton leaning against the wall, arms folded, watching the proceedings with a smirk. Others whispered that the wind carried voices near Boot Hill, Frank and Tom McClory swearing revenge in tones that sent chills down the spine. Judge Spicer himself, a weary man, reportedly confessed to a colleague that he had nightmares. In them, he sat at his bench while faceless figures stood before him, demanding justice. Each time he tried to speak, the gavel in his hand turned into a revolver, and the echo of its shot jolted him awake. The courtroom grew hotter with each passing day. Men wiped sweat from their brows, women fainted, and still the testimony dragged on. For 30 days, Tombstone lived not by the pickaxe and revolver, but by oaths and accusations. The turning point. The most damning testimony came from Ike Clanton himself. He painted a picture of helpless men gunned down by ruthless lawmen. His words carried weight, but his trembling hands and shifting eyes betrayed him. When cross-examined, his story crumbled. He contradicted himself, faltered under pressure, and revealed his hatred of the Earps more than the truth of events. Then came witnesses for the defense. They swore the cowboys were armed and ready, their pistols gleaming in the sun before the first shot rang out. They described the tension, the threats, the inevitability of the confrontation. Wyatt, finally breaking his silence, stood and declared, "I did my duty. I was not born to be killed by a Clanton or a McClory." The words rang through the courtroom like gunfire. Some gasped, others cheered, and Judge Spicer's gavel could barely restore order. The verdict. On November 30th, 1881, Judge Spicer delivered his ruling. His voice was steady, though his hands trembled slightly as he read the decision. He declared that Virgil, Wyatt, Morgan, and Doc had acted within the law as peace officers. The charges of murder were dismissed, but his words carried a warning. While I find them not guilty under the law, I cannot say they are free from moral guilt. This conflict, I fear, will not end here. The courtroom erupted. The Earps were free, but Tombstone remained divided. Some cheered them as heroes, others cursed them as butchers. And in the shadows outside, the cowboys sharpened their knives. Their thirst for revenge only deepened. An uneasy freedom. Though acquitted, the Earps walked out of the courtroom not as free men, but as marked men. The cowboys still roamed the countryside, and their allies in town glared with silent hatred. Death had been cheated once, but it would not stay cheated forever. That night, as the brothers sat in a saloon, Doc raised his glass with a bitter smile. "To justice," he rasped before coughing violently into his handkerchief. Wyatt said nothing, only staring into the whiskey before him. Some swore they saw the reflection of 3 shadowy figures in the amber liquid, 3 men who would never rest. And indeed, Tombstone's story was far from over. The curse of Tombstone legends say that after the trial, strange things began to happen in town. Doors slammed on their own in the courthouse. Horses bolted at unseen figures. Miners claimed to hear gunshots echoing from the lot where the fight had happened, even on moonless nights. An old woman swore she saw Frank McClory's ghost standing at the edge of Boot Hill, staring toward town, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Others said Billy Clanton's laughter could be heard drifting on the night wind, mocking, unbroken by death. Whether these tales were born of imagination or something darker, they gave weight to the belief that Tombstone was cursed. A town where blood once spilled could never be cleansed. Conclusion: the shadow of death remains. The Earps and Doc Holliday had survived the courtroom, just as they had survived the corral. But the victory was hollow. Their names were forever stained with controversy, and every step they took was shadowed by vengeance. The trial was meant to bring justice. Instead, it deepened the divide and set the stage for more blood. Tombstone slept uneasily, its streets haunted by both the living and the dead. And though the gavel had fallen, the true verdict would be written not in ink, but in bullets. The verdict had freed the Earps and Doc Holliday, but Tombstone was not at peace. The courtroom had merely shifted the battleground. Hatred smoldered, and in the deserts of Arizona, vengeance does not die. It festers. The calm before the storm. For a few short weeks, Tombstone seemed to breathe again. The mines churned with silver, saloons filled with gamblers, and music once more spilled into the dusty streets. But beneath the laughter and clinking glasses, a shadow lingered. The cowboys had not forgiven, and whispers of revenge spread like wildfire. Virgil Earp, still Marshal of Tombstone, tried to maintain order. He posted guards, doubled his patrols, and carried the weight of both his badge and the blood already shed. Wyatt watched silently, his hand never straying far from his revolver. Morgan smiled less, his youthful charm dulled by the trial's shadow. And Doc Holliday coughed his life away, his pale face masking the fire that still burned inside him. They all knew the peace was fragile, a candle flickering in a storm. The ambush of Virgil Earp. On the night of December 28, 1881, the storm broke. Virgil Earp left the Oriental Saloon with his cane tapping the wooden boards. His wounds from the gunfight had not fully healed, but his stride carried the stubborn pride of a lawman unwilling to bow. Then, from the shadows, came the crack of shotguns. Buckshot tore through the night, ripping into Virgil's left arm and shoulder. He fell, blood spilling onto the dirt, his cries echoing through Tombstone's darkened streets. When Wyatt and Morgan reached him, they found Virgil pale and broken, his arm shattered beyond repair. He would never again raise it in defense, never again wield a revolver with both hands. The townsfolk whispered, "The cowboys have struck back." Some claimed they saw ghostly figures standing at the edge of Fremont Street that night. 3 men, half in shadow, watching silently as Virgil was carried away. Billy Clanton, Frank McClory, Tom McClory. Their revenge had only begun. Morgan's fate. If the attack on Virgil was meant to warn the Earps, it failed. Wyatt grew harder, his eyes colder. Doc sharpened his wit and his pistol alike. But Morgan, the youngest of the brothers, still sought comfort in the saloons, where laughter and whiskey dulled the weight of blood. On the night of March 18, 1882, Morgan played billiards with friends. Laughter rose above the clack of balls. Then, without warning, a rifle shot cracked through the back door. The bullet tore through Morgan's back, shattering his spine, and exited through his chest. He collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. As his friends rushed forward, Morgan's lips moved with the finality of prophecy. "Don't let them get away with this." He died minutes later, his youthful grin forever erased. Wyatt, kneeling beside his brother's body, did not weep. He simply placed a hand on Morgan's chest, then stood with the slow, deliberate calm of a man who had made his decision. The feud was no longer about law, it was about blood. The birth of the vendetta ride, Wyatt Earp became something more than a marshal that night. He became judge, jury, and executioner. Gathering a small posse, Doc Holliday, Warren Earp, Sherman McMaster, and a handful of loyal gunmen, Wyatt declared war on the cowboys. No court, no gavel, no trial would decide the fate of his enemies. Only bullets. What followed was a campaign whispered about for generations, the Vendetta Ride. The posse hunted the cowboys across the desert, from canyon to canyon, leaving bodies in their wake. Florentino Cruz was shot down in a hail of gunfire. Curly Bill, Brocious, the outlaw leader himself, was gunned down in a bloody shootout by the San Pedro River. Others vanished into the desert sands, their bones never found. Some said Wyatt rode like a man possessed, his face expressionless as he fired his revolver with deadly accuracy. Others swore Doc Holliday laughed through the smoke, a skeleton in flesh, coughing blood but killing with precision. And still the legends grew. Miners told of thunder in the mountains on clear nights, the sound of Wyatt's vengeance echoing long after the posse had ridden on. Travelers swore they saw riders in the moonlight, ghostly figures galloping with revolvers blazing, vanishing into the sagebrush before dawn. The Curse of Blood. By the time the Vendetta Ride ended, Tombstone was scarred. The cowboys were broken, their leaders dead or scattered. But victory came at a price. Virgil, crippled, left town with his wife, haunted by his wounds. Doc Holliday, coughing harder with each passing day, drifted into legend on his way to Colorado, where death would eventually claim him. Wyatt left Arizona behind, wandering from town to town, his name both feared and cursed. But the blood spilled in Tombstone never washed away. Boot Hill Cemetery grew crowded, its graves whispering with the restless dead. Travelers claimed the desert nights carried the sound of phantom hoofbeats, the clink of spurs, and the faint echo of a dying man's last words. Don't let them get away with this. Even today, some say the OK Corral is not silent. That on certain nights, when the moon is high and the wind cuts cold, the echoes of gunfire return. Shadows rise from the dust, reenacting that 30-second blaze again and again, as if trapped in eternity. Conclusion: justice or damnation? The tale of the Earps is one of law and blood, of duty twisted into vengeance. Were they heroes defending order in a lawless land? Or were they killers cloaked in badges, their hands as bloody as those they pursued? History offers no clear answer. But the legend of Tombstone endures, not just because of what happened, but because of what it means. In the Wild West, justice was a revolver's report, and peace was written in gunsmoke. And perhaps, just perhaps, the ghosts of Tombstone still wait for us to decide. Was Wyatt Earp a savior or a curse? If you've walked with us through this legend, ask yourself, what do you believe? Was Wyatt Earp a lawman protecting justice or a killer consumed by vengeance? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to Legends of the Wild West to uncover more untold stories, where history blurs with myth and the truth is darker than legend. And remember, every week, a new story rises from the dust. Don't miss the next ride into the unknown.